Almost 90% of the videos in my channel are about the Beatles. I've said it time and time again that in my opinion, they're the greatest band in the history of music and my personal favorite. But why? What is it about the Beatles that makes so many people confidently say they're the best? Music is one of the most diverse forms of art there is. There's many other bands that have been doing it for way longer, are way better as musicians, and have also influenced the music scene greatly. But for some reason, the Beatles are still seen as the best.
Yeah, okay, hang on. Hang on. This is a song. Shut up while he's talking. Yes.
I'm really excited for today's video. I know that it's been a while since I've uploaded a video. It's been more than a month actually, and I apologize for that. It was right after I said that I was gonna upload more frequently too, which is kind of embarrassing, but we're back, and we're back with a really good video. One of the main questions I get every single time I upload a video is why is it that I so confidently say that the Beatles are the greatest band of all time? And it's a really complicated question. It's a very loaded question, mainly because often the people that disagree with me have really good arguments. For example, I often say that the Beatles are the most influential band of all time. However, when you go to genres like rock and roll, and you look at bands like the Rolling Stones, for example, that's not really true. I mean, are you really going to tell me that the Beatles, with the few rock and roll albums they released, like Let It Be, or Please Please Me, A Hard Day's Night with the Beatles, are more influential, or did more for rock and roll than the Rolling Stones with albums like Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street? Obviously not. And then you go to genres like heavy rock music and you see people like Led Zeppelin. You go to genres like metal and you see people like Jimi Hendrix and Black Sabbath. You go to genres like folk and you see people like Johnny Mitchell, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, a bunch of artists that in their own respective genres were far more influential than the Beatles. Another thing I usually say is that the Beatles are the most popular band of all time, and I stand by that, but you do have people like Michael Jackson, for example, Elvis Presley, Frank Sinatra, the Rolling Stones once again, Taylor Swift if you want to be a little bit more modern. And I know a lot of people don't like those comparisons, but you have to make them because, believe it or not, they were really close to the Beatles when it comes to popularity. Hell, even people like Coldplay, in South America, were really, really popular too, maybe even more popular than the Beatles. And I know a lot of you will probably say, well, they had technology, they had social media, they had the ability to tour, and it's true, I'm not going to say it's not, but that doesn't really change the fact that their level of fame was right about the same, even if you don't want to believe it. Another argument people usually use is longevity. You have people like David Bowie, Bob Dylan, Johnny Mitchell, discographies that go for more than 40 years and have more than 40 albums in their repertoire. And then you look at the Beatles and their 13 albums and you say, that's not really enough to call a band the greatest of all time, especially because it all happened in the time frame of 7 years from 1963 to 1970. And even though I would personally argue that that's even more impressive, the fact that they managed to do everything they did in only 7 years, so much influence and impact in the music scene in such a small amount of time, it's also valid for anyone else to argue that the Beatles didn't really have to go through the challenge of adapting to a new era. It was only the 60s. And mind you, that was no easy task. There was a lot going on in the 60s, but there was a lot going on in the 80s too, in the 90s, in the 2000s, all the new technologies, all the new genres, all the new artists bursting onto the scene. But once again, you have people like David Bowie, for example, making at least one great album per decade, and that's all the way up to the 2010s, where he released one of his best albums with Black Star, and that's something the Beatles cannot claim. Obviously, I'm not blaming anybody. I mean, they broke up in 1969, they lost a member in 1980, and they lost another member in 2001. But still, that doesn't change the fact that there's multiple discographies with multiple great albums that are way longer than theirs. So, after saying all of those things, I know a lot of you are probably really angry, and I know a lot of you probably think that the Beatles are not actually my favorite band of all time, and I just say that because, I don't know, I upload a lot of videos about the Beatles, so it's natural for me to say such a thing, but that's not the case at all. In my opinion, the Beatles were not really the best at anything per se. It was a combination of a lot of great things they have that create a perfect mix, or the closest thing to perfection I've found in an artist or a band. Allow me to explain. Let's take influence, for example. If you were to individualize a genre like rock and roll, like metal music, pop music, obviously the Beatles are not going to be the most relevant figure of that genre. The same thing with psychedelic music. You know, even though Sgt. Pepper and Revolver were major psychedelic projects and they definitely were really influential within the genre, they were not the most influential ones. You know, there's albums multiple months and even a year before Sgt. Pepper was released, and even before Revolver was released, that were already showing signs of psychedelic elements in the songwriting. But the impressive thing with the Beatles is the fact that they have influence, even if it's just a little bit, in all these different genres. So rock and roll music, metal music, heavy rock music, and all the genres I named. Maybe the Beatles are not the most relevant figure in the genre, but they are a relevant figure in every single one of these genres. Instead, the Rolling Stones don't really have a lot to do with folk music or with pop music. The same thing with Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath, and Bob Dylan doesn't really have a lot to do with rock and roll or metal music. Instead, the Beatles have connections to every single one of these genres, and you can find preludes and sort of trailers to these genres in every single one of the Beatles albums, especially after 1965. Believe me when I tell you that there's no other band like this. It doesn't matter where you look, you're not going to find another band with this amount of influence in so many different genres. And something similar happens with popularity. When you look at some of the names I mentioned before, like Michael Jackson or Elvis Presley, you're going to find that their popularity peaked when they were active, you know, when they were releasing albums and singles. Instead, the Beatles are still pretty popular today. I mean, look at the Now and Then music video, look at the Anthology project in the 90s, look at the Get Back documentary all the way back in 2021. I mean, they've enjoyed multiple peaks when it comes to their popularity, and that's not only because of, you know, the murder of John Lennon and the passing of George Harrison. There's multiple other reasons only related to the music that created these new peaks in popularity that the Beatles enjoyed. The Beatles are quite simply the most popular thing in the modern history of the world after Jesus, you know, and the fact that they sold 600 million copies, being the best-selling artists of all time, confirms that. So, when I said in the beginning of this video that other people like Coldplay, like Taylor Swift, like Drake reached similar levels of popularity as the Beatles, I only meant similar. It's not the same, especially because back then you didn't have social media, you didn't have as much exposure as the new bands and new artists have today. Now it's time to go for the most valid critique people have about the Beatles, and that is the whole discography and longevity thing. And listen, I definitely do understand what a lot of you mean by that. I really do. And the main reason I do is because longevity for me is one of the key factors for a great discography. If you're able to make great albums in totally different eras of music, that gives you a lot of credibility, you know, a lot of points. And since the Beatles were only active from 1963 to 1970, and then in their respective solo careers, they weren't really able to capture the same magic, and I know that people like Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, all of them have incredible albums in their solo discography, they weren't really the main stars. You know, in the 70s, you had people like, once again, I know I named him like 4 times in this video, but he's one of my favorites, David Bowie. You have people like the Velvet Underground, you have people like Led Zeppelin, Leonard Skinner, so many bands that completely shifted the balance of power and created so many subgenres that gave rock music new colors and made the genre exciting again after the Beatles broke up. And as solo artists, the Beatles were not really able to be a part of that revolution. They were all releasing incredible music too, don't get me wrong. Paul had Band on the Run, George Harrison had All Things Must Pass, even Ringo with his self-titled 1973 album, and John had Imagine and Plastic Ono Band. But they weren't really a part of that revolution, of that changing nature and organic feeling of the 70s. However, I feel like people who argue this don't really understand how impressive the discography of the Beatles was, even if it was only in a time frame of 7 years. I plan to make a video soon where I go into detail about the discography of the band and how every album was important, every album was influential in its own way. But if you want a quick summary, I would say that the discography of the Beatles is the perfect representation of evolution, okay, of how a band evolving and growing little by little looks like. Listening to the Beatles album per album is like watching a movie, like watching a timeline of songwriting evolution, and going through that journey is so rewarding and so exciting. You know, there's moments in Please Please Me, chord progressions, maybe a certain melody that evolves into something completely different in an album like Revolver or Rubber Soul, and noticing those moments, noticing how the evolution led to certain compositions, you know, and how something in Rubber Soul, like In My Life, for example, being so personal, evolves into something like Julia in the White Album, you know, equally personal, but in a completely different level. Those sort of moments where you kind of feel like you're growing with the band and you know their songwriting by now is moments that no other band has been able to replicate, you know, and believe me, I enjoy a lot of other discographies too, you know, like the Velvet Underground, the Smiths, Black Sabbath, David Bowie, Bob Dylan, the Talking Heads, Kendrick Lamar, A Tribe Called Quest, you know, there's many other artists that I enjoy enjoy quite a lot too. But no one really comes close to the Beatles when it comes to that experience of watching that evolution, and watching an artist grow. And that is ignoring the fact that in terms of quality, these are some of the greatest albums ever made. I mean, the White Album is literally my favorite album of all time. And then you have albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, Help, Hard Day's Night, Let It Be, Abbey Road. The quality is ridiculous. So when people ask me, why is it that you think that the Beatles are the greatest band of all time, I can only tell them that it's a combination of factors, a combination of influence, a combination of quality in their discography, a combination of popularity, a combination of history, lore, context, how music wouldn't be the same without them. The only band where you find all of these different things and accolades in one single discography is the Beatles. In my opinion, is the greatest story ever told in the music world, and for that reason, I believe they're the greatest band of all time. But of course, that is only my own personal opinion. The main reason I make these videos is because I want to know your opinion. So go ahead and leave it down below in the comments. Do you agree with me? Do you think the Beatles are the greatest band of all time? Or do you disagree and you think the Beatles are a little overrated? Let me know what you think in the comments once again. I'm really excited to see what you guys will have to say about this one. And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well. And I'll make sure to read it and fulfill requests as soon as I can. Once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.